Today in the Daily Dose, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Born in 1859, Potsdam, Germany, Queen Victoria's firstborn grandchild, Wilhelm II's close ties with Britain on his mother's side had a profound influence over his later political maneuvering as Kaiser or Emperor of the German Empire. His left arm made useless and small by a birthing trauma, at 12 years of age, his father Frederick III became King of Prussia, instilling a fierce determination in young Wilhelm to win a place in the sun for Germany. Possessed with a sharp mind and an even sharper temper, Wilhelm II developed a lifelong interest in science and technology while studying at the University of Bonn, wedding Princess Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein in 1881 for a union that welcomed the birth of 7 children. When Wilhelm was 29 years of age, his father was crowned Kaiser, and after his father passed away from throat cancer just 4 months into his reign, Wilhelm took the throne on June 15, 1888. 2 years later, Wilhelm announced his so-called new course for Germany when he broke ties with the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who had led German politics since the 1860s, bitterly predicting that Wilhelm would lead Germany to ruin. Meddling in foreign affairs with his emotions rather than strategic diplomacy, Wilhelm further damaged his reputation as a world leader during the Eulenburg-Harden affair of 1907, which suggested that many of his inner circle friends were gay, while his reputation was further tarnished by the Daily Telegraph affair of 1908, when he offended the British in a newspaper interview by stating, "You English are mad, mad, mad as March hares." After World War I broke out, following the 1914 assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Wilhelm at first skirted the notion of war against her European neighbors, eventually succumbing to pressure from his generals by declaring war on Russia and France, at the same time informing his military leadership that "you will regret this, gentlemen." While Kaiser Wilhelm II carried the title of Commander-in-Chief of the German military throughout the First World War, many historians consider Wilhelm nothing more than a puppet figurehead over a military dictatorship led by generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. And when Wilhelm's prophecy came true with Germany's eventual surrender, Wilhelm abdicated the throne on November 8, 1918, living out the remainder of his life in exile in the Netherlands, until his death from a pulmonary embolism on June 4, 1941, just weeks before Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, making the life and shaky politics of Kaiser Wilhelm II a major instigator in the war to end all wars. The Harlem Hellfighters. Considered the most celebrated African-American fighting regiment during World War I, the Harlem Hellfighters faced down racism at home before facing off with Germany longer than any other fighting unit in the war to end all wars. They came from Harlem mostly, as well as Brooklyn and towns up the Hudson River. Some were underage teenagers, while others were in their mid-40s. Many were proficient jazz musicians, including bandleader James Reese Europe, and when the force of 2,000 men landed at Brest, France, on New Year's Day 1918, they stunned their unsuspecting audience with their syncopated rhythm, so unheard of before their arrival, drawing salutes from every French soldier and sailor present that day. Originally assigned to service in janitorial roles, General John Pershing changed all that on April 15th, when he reassigned the 369th Harlem Hellfighters to combat duty, more than a month before the American Expeditionary Force's first major battle. For the next 3 months, as the Germans' primary spring offensive raged miles away from their frontline position, the Harlem Hellfighters fought through repeated skirmishes until they came under heavy artillery fire when the Germans launched the July 15th Second Battle of the Marne, which would become Germany's final offensive battle in the war. The Hellfighters pushed forward with a French counterattack, suffering 14 deaths and 51 injuries. Then came the Meuse-Argonne offensive, in which 1.2 million French and American soldiers bore down on Germany's failing frontline positions. Over the course of the month-and-a-half-long offensive, the Hellfighters would suffer 144 deaths and almost 1,000 wounded. "What have I done this afternoon?" wrote Hellfighter Captain Arthur Little in his memoir From Harlem to the Rhine. "Lost half my battalion, driven hundreds of innocent men to their death." The Harlem Hellfighters spent 191 days on the Western Front, making them the longest-serving American regiment to fight at the front lines of World War I. Upon their stand-down and return to the States, on February 17, 1919, crowds lined Fifth Avenue in New York City, honoring the Hellfighters with a much-deserved victory parade. The Hellfighters marched in French formation, 16 abreast, making their sacrifice and bravery in battle a strident rebuke to racism, even to this day. Q-ships of World War I. During the 4+ bloody years of the First World War, German advances in submarine warfare wreaked havoc and high anxiety on naval and merchant ships alike, sinking over 6,000 Allied vessels for a total loss of 14,200,000 tons. Led by British Rear Admiral Gordon Campbell, to counter the ongoing U-boat menace, the British employed an assortment of mystery Q-ships, disguising their hidden war assets within scruffy-looking timber ships, tramp freighters, passenger liners, fishing smacks, and slow-moving sailing luggers. Hoisting the colors of neutral nations, Q-ships were fitted with false funnels, while guns were hidden conveniently inside chicken coops and other deck cargo, all in an attempt to lure German U-boat crews in for a closer look, before shedding their masquerade in a fusillade of deadly gunfire. While U-boats posed a deadly threat to maritime traffic, Q-ship crews took open advantage of a U-boat's inherent limitations. Carried in limited supply within the tight confines of a U-boat, torpedoes were only accurate from a relatively short distance from their intended prey, making them vulnerable to return fire or even ramming should an attacking U-boat surface too soon near an enemy ship. To lure U-boats into their trap, Q-ships conducted staged panic parties, as Admiral Campbell described in his memoir My Mystery Ships. Dressed as common deckhands and even women in the case of Q-ship passenger liners, during a panic party, crew and passengers would pretend to abandon a sinking ship, opening fire when a U-boat had drawn sufficiently near, before dropping depth charges when desperate U-boat crews dove for safer waters. Led by professional naval officers, Q-ship crews had to act their parts on a 24/7 basis, oftentimes changing ship names, nationalities, and deck silhouettes from one port to the next. On one occasion, even Campbell's fellow officers failed to recognize him behind his bearded, scruffy persona when he disguised himself as the skipper of a timber ship. Oftentimes, when participants in a panic party took to their lifeboats, they frequently carried a stuffed parrot in a cage, furthering the authenticity of the trap, since merchant crews routinely kept parrots as shipboard mascots and pets, making Q-ships of World War I some of the gutsiest deceptions in the age of modern warfare. U-boats of World War I. Sinking some 5,000 merchant ships at a cost of an approximate 15,000 Allied lives, Germany's formidable U-boat fleet nearly brought Great Britain to her knees during the bloody years of the First World War. An abbreviation for the German word Unterseeboot, U-boats prowled international shipping lanes primarily in the North Atlantic, beginning with 20 combat-ready U-boats at the start of the war, drawing first blood on September 5, 1914, when a U-boat sank a British light cruiser off the coast of Scotland, taking the lives of more than 250 sailors. 17 days later, another U-boat sank 3 British battle cruisers over the course of an hour, this time taking the lives of 1,500 men. Announcing in February of 1915 that German and Austro-Hungarian U-boats would commence unrestricted warfare on all vessels, including merchant ships from neutral countries. On May 7th of that same year, U-20 torpedoed the luxury liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, taking the lives of nearly 1,200 innocent passengers. Fearing the sinking would hasten the United States' entry into the war, Germany eventually promised to protect the lives of passengers before sinking unarmed ships at sea. To counter the U-boat threat to maritime trade, merchant and naval ships formed convoys to cross the Atlantic, while Allied naval forces employed Q-ships, which were lifelike decoys designed to draw U-boats into unsuspecting traps for ambush and destruction. Dimly lit and claustrophobic, 50-man U-boat crews shared 2 toilets and rarely showered or changed clothes during patrols as long as 2 months at sea. Inhaling foul cocktails of bilge water, sweat, and noxious diesel fumes, mildew grew on their shoes, while charts simply rotted away in oppressive heat and humidity. Longer-range U-cruiser submarines even reached American waters by late in the war, where in May of 1918, the first German U-boat to reach North America sank 13 ships off the coast of Florida, including 6 in a single day, prompting Congress and the Army Corps of Engineers to develop the Intercoastal Waterway in 1924 for the protection of ships in the event of future world wars, making U-boats of the First World War some of the most lethal weapons in the history of human warfare. The Battle of Tannenburg. During the opening weeks of World War I, Germany had amassed most of her forces along the Western Front, in accordance with Germany's Schlieffen Plan to attack France, while Germany's 8th Army was tasked with defending the Eastern Front from an anticipated Russian invasion into Prussia. In the middle of August 1914, much sooner than the Germans anticipated, the Russians' First Army, led by Paul von Rennenkampf, advanced into the northeastern corner of Prussia, while the Russian Second Army, commanded by Alexander Samsonov, advanced into southwestern Prussia, with plans to meet up for a combined flanking maneuver against the German 8th. Instead, 8th Army replacement commanders Paul von Hindenburg and his second-in-command Erich Ludendorff set out to annihilate the Russian Second Army, which had advanced well in front of its communications and supply lines. Fought some 19 miles from the village of Tannenburg, a place where the Poles had defeated the Teutonic Knights some 500 years earlier. From August 26th to the 30th, German artillery pounded the Russian Second Army, mainly due to the Russians' lack of ciphered communications between the First and Second Armies. After 3 days of punishing assaults in sweltering summer heat, Samsonov gave the order for an all-out retreat from Prussia, running headlong into flanking German forces in the early hours of August 30th. The morning would prove to be a wholesale slaughter of trapped Russian forces as they attempted to flee across open fields without sufficient ammunition. Realizing his army was in total collapse, Samsonov walked away from his field staff into a nearby forest, ending his life with a lone bullet to his head. The Battle of Tannenburg would prove to be the biggest victory for Germany during the First World War, resulting in the near destruction of Russia's First and Second Armies. Casualties for the Germans stood at 14,000, while Russian casualties reached an estimated 122,000 to 170,000, including 50,000 killed in action and 92,000 made prisoners of war, making the Battle of Tannenburg a bloody opening salvo in a war that would ultimately take the lives of 20 million people before its end. The First Battle of the Marne. In a war that most Europeans thought would be short and decisive for the Allies, the First Battle of the Marne changed all that less than a month after the start of World War I. Following the Germans' advance across Belgium and northeastern France, by the end of August, German forces were 30 miles from Paris, after securing victories at Lorraine, Ardennes, Charleroi, and Mons, known collectively as the Battle of the Frontiers. Predicting that Paris would fall to the Germans by September 5th, French General Joseph-Simon Gallieni convinced French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre to reposition Manauri's Sixth Army in defense of the French capital. Known as the First Battle of the Marne, when German General Alexander von Kluck disobeyed orders to break off his pursuit of the retreating French Fifth Army and instead lend support to General Karl von Bülow's exhausted Second Army at the Marne River. On September 4th, 1914, after the chief of the German General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, was briefed on Kluck's disobedience, he was also apprised that his armies at the Marne had overrun their supply lines in their rapid advance on Paris. Fearing a French attack on the First Army's exposed flank, he ordered a halt to the First and Second Army's advance on Paris. His orders would come too late, since Gallieni was already on the move, supported by Allied troops from the British Expeditionary Force, led by Sir John French. 2 days later, some 150,000 soldiers of Manauri's Sixth Army attacked the German First Army's right flank, opening up a 30-mile gap in the German front line, which allowed the French Fifth Army and the British Expeditionary Force to simultaneously pour through the gap in a frontal assault on the German Second Army. Bloody fighting would continue over the next several days, including a September 7th troop reinforcement of 6,000 French soldiers who arrived at the front lines in a convoy of Parisian taxicabs in support of Manauri's now exhausted men. As for the equally weary German armies, on September 9th, Moltke ordered a full retreat toward the Aisne River, joining the First and Second Armies in a trench warfare standoff that would last well into 1918. The Allies' successful check of the Germans' advance on Paris made for one of the most decisive victories in the history of human warfare, marking an end to the Germans' two-front Schlieffen plan, at the same time setting the stage for a trench war standoff that would take the lives of 20 million soldiers and civilians before its end. The Christmas Truce of 1914. On December 7, 1914, Pope Benedict lobbied war leaders of opposing nations to agree to a Christmas ceasefire so that, in his words, the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. And while war leaders ignored the Pope's plea for a temporary peace, something never before witnessed occurred in trenches up and down the Western Front, an event so unlikely and unexpected that it stands to this day as one of the most unique moments in military history. Shivering in cold, muddy trenches along the Western Front, puffing on wet cigarettes that refused to light, morale was low on both sides of No Man's Land, which was the narrow, bomb-cratered swatch of land that separated opposing trench lines. Battle losses on both sides soured moods on Christmas Eve, in particular, the Russian defeat at Tannenburg, followed by Germany's crippling defeat at the First Battle of the Marne a week later. At 10 p.m., however, British soldiers heard Christmas carols being sung from the German side of No Man's Land, and when they snuck a cautious peek above their trenches, they saw that the Germans had used candles to light Christmas trees up and down their trench lines, "You British," a German soldier called across in English, "come over here and we'll celebrate Christmas like Christian men." A British sergeant replied, "You come halfway, we'll come halfway." Despite strict orders against fraternizing with the enemy, what happened next would stun the world when nervous soldiers on both sides clambered out of their respective trenches and met each other in no man's land, exchanging gifts of food and war souvenirs, singing Christmas carols together while exchanging stories and small talk instead of bullets and death. One British soldier set up a makeshift barber shop, charging Germans a couple of cigarettes for a battlefield trim. Others helped enemy soldiers collect their war dead, while intermittent gatherings along the Western Front witnessed the exchange of prisoners during the unplanned ceasefire. An impromptu soccer match broke out between British and German soldiers, where Germany prevailed with a final score of 4-1. A soldier from Britain's 3rd Rifle Brigade recounted a German soldier saying, "Today we have peace. Tomorrow you fight for your country, while I'll fight for mine." Good luck, he concluded, making the Christmas truce of 1914 a moment of unexpected deliverance during one of the bloodiest events in the history of human warfare. The Battle of Gallipoli. With the First World War bogged down on the Western Front by 1915, First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, proposed an attack on the Ottoman Turks, who had sided with Germany and the Central Powers early on in the war. Churchill's plan was to seize the Dardanelles Straits on the Gallipoli Peninsula of Turkey, which was a narrow passage connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara in northwestern Turkey. If successful, the invasion would allow the Allies to unite with the faltering Russians in the Black Sea, working in tandem to knock Turkey out of the war. Beginning on February 19th with a long-range naval assault on the Dardanelles, Turkish forces abandoned their forward positions while maintaining heavy fire on Allied minesweepers, stalling the Allied advance until March 18th, when 18 Allied battleships entered the straits against heavy defensive fire. 3 Allied ships were sunk in the engagement, while another 3 warships would suffer debilitating damage. After the Allied Navy's indisputable defeat, British War Secretary Lord Kitchener appointed General Ian Hamilton to spearhead a land invasion, prompting the general to amass British, Australian, French, and New Zealand troops on the Greek island of Lemnos. The Allied invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula began on April 25, 1915, and despite suffering heavy casualties, the Allies managed to establish a beachhead at Hellas on the southern tip of the peninsula and a second at Gabatipa on the Aegean coast, the later renamed Anzac Cove, in honor of Australian and New Zealand troops who suffered egregious losses against determined Turkish defenders. The Turks soon called in reinforcements from the Palestine and Caucasus fronts, setting in motion a 3.5-month bloody standoff that saw heavy casualties on both sides. In an attempt to end the stalemate, on August 6, 1915, the Allies landed troops at Suvla Bay, which they combined with a northern advance from Anzac Cove toward Sari Bair, along with a diversionary ploy at Hellas. Indecision and delay on the part of the Allies stalled forward progress in all 3 fronts, and after Turkish forces continued to flow into the region, the Allies began a December evacuation of 105,000 pinned-down troops, marking a stunning victory on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. In the end, some 480,000 Allied troops fought in the nearly 11-month Gallipoli campaign, witnessing 250,000 casualties, including 46,000 deaths. Turkey suffered a matching casualty count, with some 65,000 killed in action, making the Battle of Gallipoli one of the bloodiest campaigns in the First World War. The Armenian Genocide. During the collapsing years of the Ottoman Empire, In 1909, a political group called the Young Turks came to power in present-day Turkey. Known as the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, the group sought a standalone and ethnically pure Islamic Turkey, despite some 2 million Christian Armenians living in eastern Anatolia and present-day Istanbul. After World War I broke out in July of 1914, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and the Central Powers in their war against Russia and the Allies. And after a minor Armenian independence movement erupted in the Musa Highlands, the Ottoman army used the occasion of war to enact a forced ethnic deportation of Armenians from their homeland of nearly 3,000 years, driven into the Syrian desert during the spring and summer of 1915, in a string of death marches intended to wipe out Turkey's ethnic minority through starvation, dehydration, exhaustion, and open acts of genocide. After able-bodied Armenian men had been worked to death in labor battalions or executed outright, the brutal deportation of Armenian women and children proceeded with little resistance. Convoys of Armenians on foot were frequently attacked by sanctioned gangs of butchers, comprised of released convicts and CUP fighters, who frequently carried out their executions with scimitars and swords. For the survivors of these horrific attacks, their witness to the murder of friends and family would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. As Armenians were forced from their ancestral homes, with little destruction of their seized properties, the displacement of Armenians by the CUP also served as a means for the Young Turks to plunder the material wealth of the people they forcefully deposed. By its conclusion in 1923, when the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, some 1.5 million Armenians had perished at the hands of Ottoman, Turkish, and paramilitary forces through outright execution or the slow winnowing effects of starvation, wiping the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia completely off the map. Survivors eventually settled in some 24 countries, while even to this day, the Republic of Turkey continues to deny all charges of genocide or the existence of a deliberate plan to exterminate ethnic Armenians from their country, making the Armenian Genocide of 1915 one of the darkest events in 20th century history. The sinking of the Lusitania. Launched in 1906 by the Cunard Line, the nearly 800-foot-long ocean liner was comprised of 9 passenger decks housing a maximum 2,198 passengers, along with 850 crew members. It would be the first ship of the Cunard Line's 4-funneled grand trio of ships, which would soon include the RMS Mauretania and the RMS Aquitania. On May 7, 1915, amidst some of the worst early combat of World War I, the RMS Lucitania was sunk by a German U-boat as it made its way from Liverpool to New York City. Of the 2,000 men, women, and children aboard, 1,200 would perish after the torpedo found its mark. Arguably one of the most luxurious vessels in the age of ocean liners, the Lusitania sank in less than 18 minutes after the German torpedo struck its hull. The vessel went down in 300 feet of water, 11 miles off the southern coast of Ireland. Backlash following the sinking turned public opinion in many countries against the Huns, contributing greatly to the United States' entry into the war. Argument over whether the ship was a legitimate military target raged back and forth for many years during and after the war, as both sides made misleading claims about the ship's purpose and intent. For their part, the Germans justified categorizing the Lusitania as a naval vessel, since at the time of her sinking, the ship was carrying over 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, nearly 5,000 shrapnel shell casings, and 3,240 brass percussion fuses. The Germans further argued that the Lusitania, like many British merchant ships, routinely violated the internationally recognized cruiser rules, which forbade attacks on civilian ocean liners and non-military merchant ships. In 1982, the British indeed admitted that munitions were on board the ship, although no active weapons were aboard. As for the Germans' decision to take the lives of 1,200 innocent victims, it remains a glaring stain to their reputation as a humane and ethical nation, only to be dwarfed by the inhumanity of the Holocaust committed by the Germans in World War II. The Battle of Verdun. After Germany's advance into France was halted at the First Battle of the Marne, in September of 1914, the Germans built fortifications to control lands already taken, while the French undertook a siege warfare stance intended to break through German lines and retake their land. In a memorandum to Kaiser Wilhelm II in late 1915, German General Erich von Falkenhayn argued that the First World War could only be won by fighting a meat-grinder war of attrition against France, inflicting such mass casualties that would sap the French will to fight, which in turn would force the British to sue for peace. German war leaders chose Verdun as the ideal place to stick it to the French, a place steeped in the political history of France, as well as a geographic salient or bulge in the Western Front. Largely unaware of Germany's staggering buildup of men and war supplies, German bombardments began on February 21, 1916, overrunning the underdefended French fort Dortmund 4 days later. During the 10-month running standoff, the Germans launched some 2 million shells at Verdun during their opening round of bombardments, more than any other artillery assault in the previous history of warfare, eventually witnessing the exchange of 40 to 60 million shells by both armies before the bloodbath had ended. Germany controlled the skies during the early months of the battle, until the French assembled 226 biplanes into one of the earliest fighter squadrons in aviation history, including the storied escadrilles composed of mostly American pilots. Before the shelling ended, the Battle of Verdun left 9 French towns in total ruin. After months of back-and-forth standoffs and offensive campaigns by both sides, the French began their first and second offensive battles from October 20th until their eventual victory on December 17th, when the French retook all lands they had lost to the Germans, in turn consolidating a new front line at Beauzonville to Côte de Poivre. The Battle of Verdun would last for a staggering 302 days of combat, making it the longest and one of the most costly battles in the history of human warfare, witnessing 377,000 casualties on either side, while a combined 305,000 troops were killed or missing by the end of the battle. For the French anyway, the battle symbolized the determination of the French people during the Allies' long and bloody fight against German aggression. The Battle of Jutland. Following the January 1915 Battle of Dogger Bank, the German Navy backed away from direct confrontation with Britain's numerically superior navy, relying instead on the lethal power of her U-boat fleet to sink Allied troop and supply ships. By May of 1916, however, with the bulk of the British Grand Fleet anchored at Scapa Flow off the north coast of Scotland, German High Seas Fleet Commander Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer pressed for the resumption of naval attacks on the British coastline. When foul weather hampered his reconnaissance airships, Scheer issued a second coded message that sent his massive naval armada to the Jutland Peninsula between Norway and northern Denmark, with orders to attack Allied shipping interests, along with the secondary objective of punching a hole through Britain's formidable blockade, which had thus far blocked German access to the Atlantic. Instead, a newly created British intelligence unit, known as Room 40, cracked Scheer's code, warning British Grand Fleet Commander Admiral John Jellicoe of the impending attack, who in turn ordered his massive armada from Scapa Flow to the Jutland Peninsula. the two enemy fleets came together at 3:48 p.m. on May 31st under the command of German Vice Admiral Franz Hipper and British Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty. The 55-minute gun battle led to the loss of 2 British cruisers at a human cost of 2,000 sailors. An hour later, the arrival of Scheer's armada forced Beatty into a delaying action until Jellicoe arrived with the remaining Grand Fleet, kicking off what would prove to be the largest naval battle in the annals of naval warfare. Before Scheer slipped the field under the cover of darkness, the Battle of Jutland engaged some 100,000 men aboard 250 warships, leading to the loss of 11 German ships at a cost of 2,551 men, while the British lost 14 ships and 6,094 lives. Both sides claimed victory in what would prove to be the last major battle in world history fought almost entirely by battleships. After the Battle of Jutland, Scheer advised the German High Command that until Germany reached parity with British naval assets, their best strategy was to employ their robust U-boat fleet against Allied shipping, at the same time skirting major surface engagements in favor of attacks on isolated groups of British warships. On the flip side, the German High Seas Fleet made no further attempts to break the Allies' naval blockade for the remainder of World War I, making the Battle of Jutland a defining moment in the history of naval warfare. Today in the Daily Dose, the Brusilov Offensive. Under threat of collapse by German forces at the Battle of Veron, the longest single engagement of the First World War, France pleaded repeatedly with her wartime allies to relieve German pressure on the Western Front. The answer would come from Russian General Alexei Brusilov, commander of the Southwestern Front, and while his plan for his summer offensive was designed to divert Germany's troop levels at Verdun, his plan was opposed by other generals within the Central Powers' high command. In the end, however, Tsar Nicholas approved Brusilov's planned offensive, setting the stage for the most lethal battle of the war. Beginning on June 4, 1916, Russian artillery opened fire on Austro-Hungarian forces along a 200-mile front in present-day western Ukraine, stretching from the Pripyat marshes to the Carpathian Mountains, decimating Austro-Hungarian positions while taking 26,000 prisoners the first day alone. During the first 2 days of battle, Russian troops advanced some 47 miles across the Eastern Front, inflicting 130,000 casualties while capturing over 200,000 prisoners, forcing Central Powers leadership to divert 4 German divisions from the west by mid-June, which led to a French counterattack at Verdun on June 23rd, just 1 day before the British began their preliminary artillery assault at the Somme. By the battle's end on September 20th, 1916, the Brusilov offensive would prove to be the largest, most lethal offensive of the war, witnessing 1 million casualties for the Russians, along with near matching numbers to the Austro-Hungarian army, including 400,000 made prisoners of war, while giving up 15,500 square miles of territory. Staggering Russian losses during the Brusilov offensive would further ignite the fires of revolt back home, contributing to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, followed by Russia's subsequent exit from the First World War, making the Brusilov offensive one of the bloodiest events during a notoriously bloody war. And there you have it, the Brusilov offensive, today in the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.